What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today we're going to be taking a look at a weapon characteristic that I haven't really had a deep dive into yet, and this is Hipfire. It turns out there's actually quite a bit that goes into Hipfire. There's also some confusing descriptions when you look at the various attachments like Hipfire spread, as well as Hipfire accuracy or hip recoil control. So we're going to be breaking all of that down today, and then at the end, I wanted to share some of my favorite Hipfire builds that are incredible for those people that just want to be aggressive and constantly staying on the move while keeping themselves in close quarters fights. And diving right in, one of the big mysteries with Hipfire this time around with Modern Warfare 2 is the distinction between Hipfire accuracy and hip recoil control. Quite interestingly, many of the barrel attachments and a few other attachments as well, they will hurt one of these stats while helping the other stat. So it seems really counterintuitive. If you're trying to create the best Hipfire build possible, which one of these is the better choice? Is it better to go with hip recoil control or hip accuracy? Well, let's first have a breakdown of this. When standing still, it turns out Hipfire accuracy will very slightly improve your hip spread, whereas Hipfire recoil control appears to have little to no impact here whatsoever. If there is a change, it appears to be a negligible change, and as a result, you might immediately conclude that Hipfire accuracy must be the better stat. However, this completely flips around when you're moving, and in the vast majority of situations, you are going to want to be moving in a gunfight while hipfiring to try to evade shots. That's one of the big benefits of hipfiring, is the ability to move a lot faster than somebody that's aiming down sight. And like I said, in this case, it flips on its head. Hip recoil control will give us a very noticeably better hipfire spread while moving, whereas hip accuracy has no impact on your hip spread while moving. So that is pretty strange, but it's looking a little bit better for hipfire recoil control compared to hipfire accuracy. However, I did want to see what happens when you actually shoot with both of these stats. So what I did is I selected the same grip, and on the left, I didn't tune that grip at all, so this is my control, my baseline here. Then I tuned in the direction of hipfire recoil control with this, while leaving hipfire accuracy untouched in the tuning. And then on the right side, I left hipfire recoil control untouched, and I tuned in the direction of hipfire accuracy. And as you can probably tell, hipfire recoil control is the best here. And if I overlay these boxes, you can see hipfire recoil control is the way to go here. And as a result, if you're ever torn between these two stats, like if you're choosing a barrel attachment that hurts one and helps the other, you're most likely going to want to lean in the direction of hipfire recoil control. So that's the first really important thing to establish when we're trying to create the best hipfire builds possible. Next up, let's move into the laser category, because some of these lasers have a very big impact on our ability to hipfire. And what I did here is I isolated the laser attachments that directly impact our hipfire. For many of the guns, this is what these will be called, but as we know, the laser attachments will change names depending on the gun that you're using. Just keep in mind, they're always going to follow the same order here, even if the names differ a little bit, and they're going to have all the same stats regardless of the gun. And as we can see, when standing still, the first laser that helps with hipfire, the Schlager ULO 66 laser, this one gives us a 14% improvement to our hipfire spread. The Stavel TAC laser gives us only a 7% improvement. The Hipshot L20 gives us a 20% improvement, and the Point G3P04 gives us a 20% improvement as well. Now, of course, like I said earlier, we also have to look at this hip spread while moving, because that is probably a more important stat. And in this case, the first one gives us an 8% improvement, the second one gives us a 16% improvement, and then the third and fourth lasers here give us a 24% improvement. So obviously, if you're going for the tightest possible hipfire, you're going to want to go with one of the final two lasers, but it's really worth noting, especially after the Season 3 updates, that Point G3P04 laser, this is the one that also helps with sprint to fire time. This one is extremely visible, like completely unrealistically visible at this point. It looks like a lightsaber coming out of your gun, and it's pretty much impossible for an enemy to miss this. Whereas with the Hipshot L20, or whatever the equivalent would be, while the laser is visible, it's got very faint visibility in comparison, but we don't get the sprint to fire improvement. And to me, I'm definitely willing to sacrifice that sprint to fire improvement in exchange for this more faint visible laser that an enemy won't be able to see nearly as effectively as that Point G3P. And as a result, the top choice for me on a hipfire build is going to be that Hipshot L20 laser. And with that, that wraps it up for the laser category of attachments. Now let's move on to the grips, because grips can also have a pretty big impact on our hipfire spread. And with this, while there are some angled grips that will be helping with your hipfire to some degree, the ones that tend to help the most are going to be the vertical foregrips, and therefore that's what I'm going to be focusing on here, just to keep things fairly simple. And it turns out, with every one of the vertical foregrips, our standing hipfire spread will be improved by about 15%, Whereas quite interestingly, while moving, none of these grips seem to have any impact on our hipfire spread, and that was quite a big surprise to me. You might be thinking these grips are great to help with hipfire, but in an actual in-game situation when you're strafing in a gunfight, these aren't really doing much for you, at least when it comes to your standard hip spread. Having said that though, another element of hipfire is as you fire your gun, your hipfire spread will increase with every shot that fires, up to a maximum amount, and it will very quickly start to reduce after each shot fired. And what I found here is there is one standout grip here when it comes to this, and this is the Cronin Groove Shot. This one doesn't seem to spread out nearly as much as any of these other vertical foregrips when firing your gun, and as a result, if we are going for the best possible hipfire build, I would highly recommend using the Cronin Groove Shot on your weapon. And that right there wraps it up for the more universal things that you want to be looking for when creating any hipfire build that you want. However, I did also want to make a note. It turns out any gun that has a no stock attachment or collapsed stock attachment, any one of those stock attachments that really significantly hurts your recoil but helps a lot with like your movement speed and your sprint to fire speed and stuff, these ones also help quite a bit with your moving hipfire spread. Based on my testing, you get a roughly 18% improvement to your moving hipfire spread by using this particular style of stock attachment. And therefore, if you're trying to make a hipfire build and the gun that you're making that build on happens to have this style of a stock, I would definitely recommend using that as well. Just keep in mind though, if you do want to aim down sight at that point, this tends to have a very big negative impact on your recoil, so it will be limiting you in other ways outside of hipfire. And with that, that's finally going to wrap it up for the breakdown of hipfire. Now I just wanted to share a few excellent hipfire builds that I really like using so far now that I've got this new knowledge of how hipfire works. All of these are going to be SMGs just because SMGs are best suited to hipfire builds, outside of shotguns of course, but that's a totally different story. But the first one I wanted to share here, which has a ridiculously tight hipfire spread, this is the Vel 46. And with this, of course, we're using the Cronin Groove Shot as well as that Hip Shot L20, and I've got these tuned for the best possible hipfire stats here. I also have the LM Series 7 barrel because this one helps with hip recoil control, and I also have that tuned for recoil steadiness and damage range. It is worth noting recoil steadiness also applies to hipfire, so that will impact the total magnitude of vertical recoil while hip firing, so it's really nice to counteract that a little bit. We've also got the collapsed stock on this, which you can't tune, unfortunately, but that does help with hipfire. And then finally, we have the Schlager Soldier Grip, which is mainly going to be helping for our sprint to fire speed here, but we can also tune this for recoil steadiness to help a bit there as well. This build gives us one of the tightest possible hip spreads in the entire game, and it also has very little recoil while firing it. It's got a very high fire rate, and the default magazine capacity is pretty solid at 40 rounds, and that just makes this a great all-around hipfire setup. As for the next one I wanted to share, this is with the Lockman Sub, and while the hip spread isn't going to be quite as tight as the MP7, I still find this to be excellent for hip firing, largely because we do get a better time to kill potential out of this, and we still get a great hip fire spread. With this, of course, we're using the same underbarrel and laser. We've got the stockless mod. I did put the 40 round mag on this just because we are going to be missing a fair number of shots while hip firing, and it's nice to have a larger magazine capacity for dealing with multiple enemies. And then we have the Lockman Pulsar barrel, tuned for recoil steadiness and damage range. And then finally, I did want to share a PDSW stealth hipfire build, and this is a stealth build because we're using the 16-inch Cloak 90 barrel, which has an integrated suppressor, which currently isn't working the same way as all the other suppressors, but maybe it'll help a little bit. Primarily the reason we're using this though is so that we can unlock the underbarrel section so we can use that Cronin Groove Shot. We once again have the Hip Shot L20. This time we've got the TV Tac Comb with recoil stabilization for our tuning, and the Bruin Q900 grip, which is going to help us quite a bit with our sprint to fire time. And while this one does have the widest hip spread out of the builds I shared today, I still find this to be an excellent setup, largely due to the fact that we have a great default magazine capacity, an amazing sprint to fire time, and a really high fire rate, which is super beneficial for hip firing. And with that, that's going to wrap it up for today's video on the hipfire breakdown, as well as some excellent hipfire builds that I wanted to share for you guys. And this is where I'm curious to hear from you guys in the comments down below. What do you think about the current state of hipfire in Modern Warfare 2? Do you think hipfire is in a good place? Or do you feel like maybe some guns need improvement to hipfire? Or do you think maybe hipfire is too good and they should be decreasing our hipfire accuracy? If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.